Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm your token web nerd today, also Mac nerd, so apologies for any issues with today's presentation. I'm here to talk to you about HTML5 and CSS3. I use these technologies every day. I've been using HTML5 HTML for about 12 years. I do it every day. I have to deal with browser issues. I'm on the front line. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is HTML and CSS5. We've lived through quite a lot. We've survived 2 browser wars, the .com crash, and whatever the hell this is that we're living through right now. And it's good to see so many people still up for it. The web is not dead. The web is just about to come alive, thanks to these 2 technologies. Just a bit of a disclaimer. I'm no expert. I'm a fanboy. Every day I learn something new about this stuff, and I'm hoping that you guys can teach me a thing or two. Strictly speaking, there is no question time, but I urge you all to stick up your hands if you have an issue. So I'll jump right in. We're covering HTML5, and I'm going to talk through some of the new elements, forms, the semantics of the new elements, and I'll touch very briefly on JavaScript. Another thing we'll be covering today, of course, is CSS3. I'll show you some of the new selectors, the new properties, and how to embed fonts on your websites. There is a lot to cover on this topic, so I'm not going to give you everything. Today, I'm just going to show you stuff that I find very useful and I use on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully you can go home after this and build websites with these technologies. It'll just work, and I'll show you how. So, what is HTML5? Basically, it's the next version of HTML. HTML started in 1991 by a great man called Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the godfather of the web, I suppose. Historically, HTML has been governed by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And back in the late 90s, they got really, really excited about this new technology called XML. I'm sure you're all familiar with XML. And the W3C decided that they're going to wrap XML into HTML and make this awesome thing called XHTML, which was great. And we all fought really hard to start using XHTML because it made sense. You had to close your tags. Everything had to be lowercase. It was neat. It was tidy. It was structured. Then they released this thing called XHTML 2.0, which was meant to save the world. It did no such thing. It bombed massively. And the major problem with it is that it was not backward compatible. So if you build things with XHTML 2.0, you were essentially breaking the past web. So in 2004, some of these W3C nerds got pissed off, and they went and started their own thing. And that own thing was called the Web Hypertext Application Technology Workgroup, also known as WHATWG. And these are the guys who were responsible for HTML5. They were like, forget this XHTML 2.0 business. We want something that is robust, that will work both in the future and for older websites. And it's slightly different to the W3C. The W3C is democratic. People vote on things to go in or come out. And the downside to this is it takes forever for things to actually happen. So the WhatWG guys, it's basically one dude called Ian Hickson. He used to work at Google, exceptionally smart guy, like borderline autistic. So he started this WhatWG thing, and basically he's the boss. People give him suggestions and he'll go, yes or no. So it's slightly different. As it turns out, he makes really good decisions, and HTML5 is an example of how that process works. Now, what's happened recently is the W3C and the WhatWG have come together, and they are now both owning the HTML5 standard. So things are looking up and things are moving pretty quickly. You can use these technologies today. So I guess the next question is, why HTML5? Progress, I guess. It's nice to move from 4.01 to a nice 5, I guess. Essentially, the idea behind HTML5 is to support existing content. Phrases like "don't reinvent the wheel" and "pave the cow paths" are very fundamental to the core of HTML5's design principles. For years, designers have been doing HTML in a specific way. May not be the best way, but that's how people have been doing it. So HTML5 tries to take these common principles and roll it into the spec. Rather than shun people for not closing tags, they're going, it's up to you. Which is great. It can be scary because you can have really, really ugly looking HTML, but it's valid. So if we look at this bit of code, very familiar to almost all of you if you build websites. This is your standard XHTML head of a document. And I fought for a very long time. I'm a standards nerd. So I fought and I kicked some ass at work to get this to be the standard. And then this came along and kind of blew my mind a little bit, because it's exactly the same, but look how small it is. There's very few attributes. You no longer need to tell the script that it's JavaScript, because what other front-end scripting language is there? My point exactly. So, and this becomes quite important because not only are we presenting the web on browsers, on PCs and Macs, but we're also presenting them on mobiles, on iPhones, on Windows phones, you name it. The web is now accessible wherever you go. And specifically with mobile devices, broadband tends to cost a fair amount. So the more bytes we can save, the better off. It's kind of like the 90s all over again. And HTML5 is good at saving those bytes. I mean, you just have to look at that and compare it to that, and you can see you're saving heaps. Right, so I'm going to show you some of the new elements. There are a lot of them, and you can immediately see that these elements kind of look like things that you're going to be using every day. And for me, HTML5 isn't about whether you close your tags or whether you use quotes or if you use uppercase or lowercase. For me, it's about the semantics. It's about how you roll it into a perfectly meaningful bit of code. We are embedding a lot more audio and video onto websites. It's becoming a lot more common thanks to our increase in broadband. Blogs are full of time-based articles and sections. The very layouts that we produce every day contain headers and footers, navigation areas, and sidebars. And this is how that might pan out. This is a top-down view of what a website may look like by using these new elements. So what I'm going to do is just jump in and show you some of these everyday elements that you can go home and use right now. The first one is the header element. Now, this guy, Ian Hickson, when he was working at Google, he had access to bajillions of websites, being Google. And he went through and he noted all the common usage of class attributes through millions of websites. And he came up with a bunch of them that get reused often and often, one of which is header. I'm sure all of you have used an ID of header or class of header. Those days are over because you've got your own tag. And basically, the header is used to group a set of H1 or H1 through to H6 elements, like your page title or a heading and a subheading. And you can have more than one header on a page. I'll explain this further down the line. And this is how you might use it. So you can see I've grouped my H1 and my H2 in the header element. And very similar to the header element, we have the footer element. And this typically contains metadata about the enclosing section, who wrote it, the date it was written, links to related documents, copyright information, that sort of thing, as illustrated above. Another very common usage is navigation. So we now have a new nav element, and these generally contain links to other documents or parts of a document. Not all groups of links, however, will sit in a nav element. Generally, the nav element is for primary navigation. And this is how you might mark that up. You still need to use a list in your nav element, which is fairly standard. It helps accessibility and SEO, so don't forget your handy list. The next element in our toolbox is the aside element. And this, often used for tangentially related content. It's generally, the aside is considered separate from the main content, but somewhat related. This is an example of how that might be used. On a blog, you have your little links down the side. You could use your aside for that. Now, the section element is a tricky one, because essentially what this does is it represents a section of a document, and a section itself can have its own hierarchy. So you can have 5 sections on a page, and within each of those sections you can have an H1, but they all relate differently to each other. You can nest it. Examples of a section may be chapter of a book, tabbed pages, perhaps. On the home page, it could be the contact information, the news information, and an introductory paragraph. Each of those can be marked up using a section, as illustrated here. And you can see in this example, I have nested a few sections. And each of those sections has an H1. And it gets pretty complicated down the line, but it's great because you can now have as many H1s as you like contained within sections, because each section is its own little section. I'll just say section again, because heaps of those words. Article. Well, that's a good question. I was just asked what the SEO issues are with having multiple H1s. I am not speaking for Google because I have no idea, nor am I speaking for Bing or any other search engine. But as far as I know, they are fully supportive of HTML5. I don't think any of them will use the new hierarchy algorithm quite yet, but they're not going to penalize you for using multiple H1s. So you can use this right now. Google doesn't really care that much about H1s. Title's more important, and the content itself is very important. So don't be too concerned. And based on the fact that Ian Hickson, the guy who invented HTML5, comes from Google, I'm guessing it's not going to be too much of an issue. Well, currently, as far as I know, no screen readers are supporting this. However, screen readers give you the ability to pull out H elements. So based on this, you would get a number of H1 elements. It will take a while for most technologies, including screen readers and browsers in general, to keep up with this new stuff. But if you use good markup and it makes sense, chances are it's going to make sense for screen readers. Far better than using nested tables and nasty things like that. An article is not too dissimilar from a section, and there's often fights about when to use a section and when to use an article. The basic rule of thumb is an article is something you can pull out of a page and it can still contain meaning. Think of it like a RSS feed, for example. Each article within an RSS feed will have its own article element. And you can have sections in articles and headers in articles, or H1s, anything really. So it's, when marking up web pages, just be sure that you use the section correctly and the article correctly, and sometimes it may just have to be a decision on your part. It's kind of wishy-washy at this point, but still very useful. Now, this is a big dude, the video element. Of course, what this allows you to do is embed video in your website. And this is native video. You no longer need to rely on external plugins to render video. Most modern browsers, Firefox, Safari, IE9, will support this new video element. And this is how you might mark it up. It has built-in controls. You can give it a default image, which is the poster.jpg. You can give it a width and height. And in this example, this is a cross-browser example, because currently different browsers support different codecs. A lot of them support H.264. Some of them support OGG. So this is covering all the bases. And essentially, if your browser doesn't understand what the video element is, it goes through it until it finds something it can understand. And in this case, it would go through and find the Flash embedded video. But your modern browsers would hit the proper sources first. So this is a good way to start marking up video from now. There is also an audio element, which is pretty much identical to the video element, except there's no pictures. Same idea when it comes to markup. And this supports AAC or MP3. IE9 will support those two formats. Another new and very exciting addition to HTML5 are the forms. Now, hands up who enjoys marking up forms. One person. Loser. Anyway, things get far more exciting now because HTML5 have introduced a bunch of new input types. They've been listening to what web developers and designers have been wanting over the years, and they've just rolled it in. Now, I might just state this now, that only those three browsers support these types. However, browsers that don't understand these new types will just default to type equals text. This is a good thing. This means you can start using these things now. If you use a range, so type equals range, what it will do in some browsers, I'm guessing it's probably Opera and Safari, will produce a little sliding bar. So it's all these widgets that you use jQuery and various JavaScript things to produce now. They've just rolled it into HTML. And it's no longer your concern to worry about that. It's up to the browser vendors to make sure that it works. So use these now, and those people who are using a modern browser will get quite a nice experience. And those who aren't will just get a text box. So no loss, really. A few more additions to the forms is they've added a few more attributes to the form input types, one of which is placeholder. And this makes a lot of sense. A lot of input fields you'll see with the text in the input field, and if you click in the input field, that text disappears and then you can type. Well, that's what placeholder is. Autofocus, one guess what that does. Required. Now, this is an interesting one. Basically, browsers are now in charge of form validation. And I'm in no way suggesting you shouldn't validate forms on the back end. You should always, always have server-side validation. But now, by using the required attribute, it makes front-end validation a lot easier. And it's no longer your issues. Browsers have to do all those hardcore regular expressions to make sure that that email address is in fact an email address. Now, it's worth noting that autofocus and required are Boolean attributes. They require no equals blah, blah, blah. They're just there or they're not. Autocomplete is also a Boolean attribute, but it's slightly different because all form fields by default have autocomplete on. So in order to disable that, you have to have autocomplete off. Kind of strange, but that's the way it goes. Now, I'll talk briefly about the semantics of HTML5. All these new elements means less divs, less meaningless stuff floating around on your page. So if you have a list of links, use a navigation element to mark them up. This makes sense. Search engines love it. Accessibility will absolutely love it as well. Maybe not quite yet, but moving forward, you're going to be future-proofing. It adds richer meaning to documents. And this presentation would not be complete if I did not mention microformats. Now, microformats are a way to extend the semantics of your markup. Let's say you want to mark up an event or some contact details. You can use microformats to add further information. I'm not going to get into microformats because that's an entire 1-hour session on its own. But just Google microformats or go to microformats.org and use these today. because you can. It just uses the class attribute. Great stuff. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you may be somewhat shocking, but at the same time, it is easily the best thing in HTML5. I'll give you a moment to look that over and immediately think to yourselves, that's all kind of wrong. But it isn't. That is allowed in HTML5. You can now wrap block level elements in an anchor element. Hooray! My favorite thing in the world. And this is my least favorite thing in the world, JavaScript. Now, HTML5 not only includes these new elements, but it also includes a bunch of new JavaScript stuff. I'll add another disclaimer here. I'm not a programmer, so don't ask me questions about JavaScript. Thanks. What's interesting to note, though, is most of these JavaScript things have existed for a very, very long time. Any guesses where most of these things came from? Internet Explorer 5. Remember that? Well, they invented some very, very cool things, including drag and drop. Drag and drop was invented when IE5 came out. Most of you would have probably not ever used it. But nowadays you can use it. You have all of these new JavaScript handlers that you can now mess around with. If you want to see an example of drag and drop working, try and drag an attachment into Gmail. And I don't know if any of you have tried that before, but you can drag an attachment from your desktop and just drop it in Gmail and it'll attach it. Magic. The next thing is the Canvas JavaScript API. And what this basically does is it allows you to create dynamic images. You can draw shapes, you can fill colors, you can do gradients and patterns. All browsers support this other than IE6, IE7, and IE8. There are fallbacks. You can use, but that's quite all right. IE9 has done a sterling job to incorporate the Canvas stuff. It's well nerdy, so those of you who are that way inclined, give it a go because it's a lot of fun. The next bit, and this is one of my favorite bits, is the get element by class name. Why this has been out of the JavaScript for so long, I will never know, but it's finally made it in, so you can now select elements based on a class. But it gets even better because they have this query select all. And what this does is basically what jQuery does. Anyone use jQuery? Isn't it magic? Well, now magic is rolled into JavaScript itself. You can use the query selector all, and you can use any CSS selector you want. So in this case, I'm selecting anything with test class. You can use IDs, you can use children selectors, anything in CSS you can now use there. I'll cover off the CSS stuff later on. Local storage. This is awesome. This is like cookies on crack. Rather than having a few bytes to play with, you now have megabytes. And what makes it even more interesting is you can use a structured query language syntax to retrieve the data out of the local storage. How you do that is up to you to find out. Another very nifty addition is offline application cache. And you add that to your HTML element. You do some magical tweaking to your web server, and you can have offline caching. Now, this is particularly useful if you're building mobile web apps, because you can't always guarantee that you're going to be online. So you can save things locally, and it just runs as if it were online. And what's cool is that it triggers an event when your browser comes back online. So you can have an event listener that listens for that online status, and the moment that happens, bam, you can shoot your data up to the web server, no issues. Pretty cool stuff. Anyone nodded off yet? Okay, cool. So now the exciting stuff, CSS3. This is where the fun really, really begins. There's a bunch of things I'm going to show you, some new CSS3 selectors, some new properties to play with, and how to embed fonts. Very exciting. Now, the selectors you're about to see will work across all browsers, excluding IE6, 7, and 8. But IE9 supports all of these, and it's great because you can do some very, very cool stuff with these new selectors. That's all of them. Some of them are pretty full on. Most of them I'm going to skip over, but I'm going to show you the ones that are particularly useful. This first one is a substring matching attribute selector. So we've used the attribute selectors before. It's part of CSS 2.1. Now we can do some more detailed things. The first example there will find anything that starts with a class of nav. The next one with the $sign will find anything that ends with nav. And the third one will find anything that contains the word nav. Quite useful. And things get even more exciting when we learn about pseudo classes. Now, this is the nth child pseudo class. This is awesome. It can either take a keyword like odd or even. It can take a number, or it can take some sort of equation. Now, the first example will match the third P element. That's what the 3 represents. The second example will match all odd Li elements. So you can really see what's going on here, right? Doing like table alternate row colors, no longer need JavaScript or excess class attributes. You can just use that. And the third one basically selects every third element, but it starts after the 10th element. So that's what the plus 10 means. You can omit that, and it'll just start at the beginning. It's well worth investigating the nth child. It's great. And related to the nth child is the last child. Now, I use this quite a lot when styling list items, and you put an underline, a bottom line on all of the list items, but the last list item you don't want a line underneath, this is how you would get rid of it. Very, very useful. This one is kind of quirky, but kind of fun, and also very, very useful. WYSIWYG editors on CMSs. It's everyone's hell, right? Well, this may help a little, because what this will do is it'll allow you to style empty elements. So your users are in the WYSIWYG editor, and they hit enter 5 times, and there's like 5 empty P tags or div tags or something. You can use this CSS to hide those, which makes things quite exciting and less ugly on the front end. And this one is kind of cool. Not particularly useful, but your brand people will love it, because now when you select text on the site, you can make it the same color as your brand, or you can change the font, you can make it bold or do whatever. So what this does is allow you to style selected text. Not overly useful, but kind of fun. So now I'm going to talk about some of the new properties available in CSS. And this is the heavy lifting stuff. This is where the magic really, really happens. But before I get into it, I just want to speak briefly about vendor prefixes. Now, those of you who do a lot of CSS, you've probably come across these before. Basically, browsers have adopted this method to include new cutting-edge CSS features. And basically, they put these in so you can help test these new implementations of CSS. The first one represents Microsoft, obviously, so your IE browsers. Probably, I think from IE7 upwards, you can use that prefix. Mozilla, the Moz for Mozilla, WebKit for all your WebKit browsers, KHTML for your Linux users using the Conqueror browser, and O is for Opera. Now, there is some debate whether or not it's a good thing to use browser prefixes. Some people say it ends up that you're forking your code. Personally, I use them. If I want rounded corners to appear, I will use a vendor prefix to make sure that that happens. So it is up to you at the end of the day, but please note that the examples that I'm going to show you may require that you use these browser prefixes. Right, the first one is opacity. Now, this has been around for a while. Internet Explorer uses the filter, the CSS filters. I don't know if any of you guys have used that before to achieve this similar thing. It's now rolled into IE9. and it works across all those other browsers up at the top. So the first two examples set the opacity of an element, and it's probably worth noting that any child element will also have that opacity. So if you have a div and you've got a bunch of things nested in that div, all of it will have the same opacity. And it uses a point. So that's 80% transparent. Sorry, 80% opaque, and the one below is like completely. The next two, the RGBA and the HSLA, allow you to apply a background color to an element, but apply a bit of transparency to that background color. So I'll just talk about the RGBA because no one really uses the HSLA one, but you can if you're that way inclined. I don't know why you would. But so RGBA, the values are red, green, blue, and your alpha transparency. In this case, it's 50%. So it's great. You can use this any place you can use a color. So background colors, font colors, shadow colors, border colors, anywhere you can apply a color attribute, you're either using the hex value. Now you can just use the RGBA and apply a bit of transparency. Very cool. This is a pretty exciting one as well, and that's the background size. You can now tell your background images to scale based on pixel values or percentage values or M values. And of course, you can modify those using JavaScript to do some pretty cool things. You will, however, have to use your vendor prefix for Firefox on this one, I believe. This is particularly groovy. You can add multiple background images to one element. Now, this is useful if, I guess in the olden days, if you wanted to do rounded corners, this would have been a good way of doing it, but those days are long gone. So multiple images on one element, and you can apply positioning to each of those elements separately. As you can see, I have image 01, image 02. I could apply X and Y coordinates to either of those to move them around my element. This is an interesting one, a little bit tricky to get your head around, but this allows you to create image borders. Have any of you used CSS sprites before? A handful of you. CSS sprites are a nifty way to contain all your images in one file. And what you would do is you would use the background position element to move that around. It's like a clip. And so you have a visible area, and your background image you can just move around and show different bits of an image. Same concept with the border images. So those four values represent the offset for each of the borders. So that's top right, bottom left. It's worth investigating that. A little difficult to explain, but if you read some documentation, it'll become perfectly clear. The next one is border radius. Can I get a hell yeah for rounded corners? Woo! Finally, it's taken so long. And it's that easy. You can set a border radius of 10 pixels, and that will give 10 pixel rounded corners on all corners. Or, if you're feeling a bit fancy, you can do individual corners. So border top right radius, we'll just do the top right border, and you can create some interesting shapes. You can even make circles. This is a pretty cool one, especially if you're dealing with content management systems and you don't know how much text someone is going to insert to their WYSIWYG editor. You can give it a text overflow and just show, the three little dots. Very, very useful. As you can see, Firefox doesn't support this. Only the latest nightly builds of Firefox support this, but at the same time, you can still use it because those browsers that don't understand it will just ignore it. Now, this is a very interesting addition. This allows you to actually change the way something is displayed on a page. You can change the angle of it, you can change the size of it, you can skew it. So this is good for like rollovers. If you want something to shimmy when you roll over it, you can use this technique. So the first one allows you to skew an element, so you're transforming and skewing it by a particular degree. The next one is you can change the scale. You can rotate images. And of course, you can mix them all together and do a bunch of them. And what's cool is when you combine this with animations. Now, it's only those guys up at the top that will support animations at this point. But browsers that don't understand animation will just ignore it. So what this particular example will do is it's going to change the opacity from fully visual to completely gone, but it's going to ease it out, and it's going to take 1 second to do it. So when I hover over that image, it's just going to fade out, look really, really hot. You used to have to use like jQuery or Flash for that, but now it's wrapped up in CSS3. It's quick. It's awesome. Right, now, this is a big one, embedding fonts. I bet we're all tired of Comic Sans and Arial. No, just me? Fair enough. Well, what this allows you to do is embed any font that you own and have the correct licensing on a website. And this is kind of a tricky situation because you can't just go ahead and embed Helvetica because there's certain licensing issues. Linotype will probably hunt you down and beat you with a ligature. So what I recommend you do is use a service. Something like typekit.com is a good place to start because they've dealt with all the licensing issues for you. But if you're feeling particularly crafty and nerdcore, then you can always use the CSS font face stuff. I threw in a smiley for good measure. This is actually completely valid. The smiley is there for a reason. Sometimes when you view something and you have to wait for something to download, usually JavaScript, there's this flash of unstyled content that kind of goes, bleh, and then it sorts itself out. That smiley face prevents it. Plus, it makes you smile every time you look at it, so that's always fun. And this is a cross-browser solution. So we have the EOT, which stands for the Embedded Open Type, and that's for IE 6, 7, and 8. And then you've got the WOF format, which is the Web Open Font Format. And this is now a standard as governed by the W3C. And IE9 now supports the WOF format. And TTF is TrueType fonts, of course. So what we're doing here is covering all the bases. You can see we've also got SVG. And this is for older versions of Safari and WebKit browsers. Just be careful. You have to make sure that you can indeed embed the font. Otherwise, you will get into a lot of trouble. We don't want that. As I was mentioning before, these are some great services. Typekit.com. They have relationships with all or most of the really big type foundries. Font, the Adobe fonts are available. There's a bunch of them. And what you do is you go there, you sign up, you pay a small annual fee, and you have access to all of these fonts. You stick a bit of JavaScript in your document, at the top of your document, and then using your CSS, you can just access these new fonts. There's a bit of a download, but it caches it nicely. It's on a CDN, so wherever you are in the world, it'll find the closest version and throw it at your browser. If you're looking for fonts that are free and you can embed on your site, you can go to fontsquirrel.com. And what's cool about fontsquirrel.com is it automatically generates that for you. So, in fact, this I got directly from FontSquirrel. I got the Titilium font. I downloaded the font pack, and it produced the CSS for me. And I just whack it in my CSS file, and I'm good to go. And then there's code, the Google Code web fonts thing. And that's basically a very small subsection of fonts that Google allows you to embed. And they've basically hooked up with Typekit to produce that for you. Now, everything I've shown you kind of sort of work a little bit, sometimes, depending on what browser you use. So the important thing here is making sure that when you go home and you use this, it will work. So I guess what I'm going to show you now is how to get it to work and make sure that cross-browser-wise, things are looking sweet. The first thing to do is to visit this website, modernizer.com. And Basically, it's a little script you add to the head of your document that enables you to use some of these HTML5 features as well as deal with older browsers. So the first thing it does is what is called an HTML5 shiv. Now, in older versions of IE, in particular IE 6, 7, and 8, that browser doesn't understand any of these new elements. So other browsers like Firefox and Safari or whatever, they don't really know what these elements mean, but they will still display them. IE is a lot more strict. They're like, this is not an element I know, so they're not going to show it. But what this does is it forces the browser to recognize it as a new element. So we are creating a new element in the DOM and placing it into the document. And this means that IE will just play beautifully. Now, you don't need to worry about doing this JavaScript. That modernizer script just does it for you. The next thing modernizer does, you can see that there's some pink stuff that's writing, right? So what this does, modernizer attaches these classes to the HTML element. So you can see this particular example is Firefox 3.6. So it can support audio, it can support box shadow, it can support opacity. It can't support CSS animations. It can't support CSS transitions. So you can see it does some feature checking for you. And based on that, you can do things like this in your CSS. So you can say dot multiple BGs, apply some CSS for those browsers that can support multiple BGs. If your browser doesn't support multiple BGs, then you can have some fallback. Once again, some people might consider this forking of code. I consider it progressive enhancement. So you can, and I recommend that you do use that. Another thing it does is it creates a modernizer object on the DOM, which allows you to check via script whether a certain thing exists. And this example checks to see whether the input type of date exists. If it doesn't, then you can just use your default date picker JavaScript fallback if you want. Those browsers that do support the date picker will just show the date picker. Very, very useful. That's step one. Make sure that you include the modernizer script in your site and you're good to go. Now there's a lot more links and resources which I'll walk through. I'll leave this slide up for a while so you can take photos and jot them down, and I'll explain what each of them is and does. Now the first one is an HTML5 video and audio embedding script. And this is completely cross-browser. It supports H.264, FLV, WMV, MP3. And this is across all browsers. If your browser doesn't support HTML5, it'll just fall back to Flash. Tiny bit of JavaScript that you embed in your page. So if you've got a lot of video and audio that you want to embed on your site, use that. It's great. The next one, CSS3 Pi, is basically a punch in the face for the older versions of IE that don't support these things. It is an HTC file. Has anyone used an HTC file before? It's a Microsoft-specific hypertext component that you can include. And what this does is it kind of kicks IE a bit and says, come on guys, let's use rounded corners, let's use gradients, let's use drop shadows. Very nifty. It's worth noting that it does add a bit of load to your page, so just use it sparingly, or if you really, really have to. CSS3 Please, similar idea, except it doesn't produce an HTC file for you. It's one page that shows you cross-browser versions of all the CSS things. So if you want to do drop shadows or rounded corners, it'll show you the correct filter, the Microsoft IE filter that you could use. It also gives you all the browser prefixes built in. HTML5 test is a great thing. You just go there with your browser and it will tell you what HTML5 elements and features your browser will support. HTML5 rocks is not only something you should say every day, but it's a cool website that illustrates some of these new HTML5 things. It's a Google initiative, and a lot of it demonstrates the new Canvas stuff and how, I guess, you can replace a lot of what you were doing in Flash with Canvas and animations and that sort of thing. So it's a good place to go and see what is capable. Chances are most of what you see there will run beautifully in IE9, what with the hardware acceleration. The next link, the HTML5 Doctor, is where I probably spend most of my time. A great website. They will find a new HTML element, so the nav element, for example, and they'll do an extensive write-up about the nav element. They'll explain how and when to use it. They'll explain problems with it, because it's also worth noting that HTML5 isn't finished yet. So these things are constantly changing, and HTML5 Doctor helps keep you abreast of all these changes. The next one is the HTML5 IntelliSense schema for Visual Studio 2008 and 2010. So visit that, download it, add it to Visual Studio, and you're good to go. I seem to have completely churned through that. So I'll open up for some questions. Speak loudly. Yes? Yes. The question was, I mentioned earlier that HTML5 is not finished, and how is that going to relate to a production environment? Very good question. I use HTML5 on a daily basis. I release things to production with HTML5. What I've shown you today enables your browsers to render those things perfectly. Now, HTML5, according to the standards dudes, is going to be finished by 2022. Any ideas when CSS 2.1 was finished? It's not. It's still going on. And this is the problem with the W3C. They take forever to make any decisions. So, yes, from that point of view, it's never going to be finished. But what are browsers supporting? What are browsers rolling in? Browsers support all of CSS 2.1, even though it's not finished. And the same can be said for HTML5. So from a production point of view, do it. I highly recommend that you do. There's a lot of good fallbacks. If you use Modernizer, if you use some clever CSS, your sites will work well. And remember, your website doesn't need to look the same in all browsers. Each browser is different. Each computer is different. So don't get too hung up about that. And if your designers give you hell, well, fight. I'd be keen to watch that. Yeah. Is HTML5 going to be a Silverlight killer? I think it may challenge it, especially when it comes to video and audio embedding. I don't think HTML5 is going to be a Silverlight killer. I don't think it's going to be a Flash killer. There's still going to be place for those sorts of rich applications online. I think HTML5 has certainly scared the bejesus out of the Silverlight team and the Flash team, and there's nothing like a bit of competition to get things excited. Yes?
Two questions. The first one is, how much easier is HTML5 now doing something like a 3-column dynamic type layout? And the second part of that question is, subjectively, how would you say, how much would you say HTML5 has improved your productivity as a web developer?
Okay, first question is, how is HTML5 going to help you do like 3-column equal height layouts? HTML5 is not really going to help you at all, because that will be achieved using CSS. Now, there is a column part to CSS3, which allows you to have flowing columns. Not very well supported, hence me not discussing it today. What HTML5 does allow you to do is give each of those 3 columns a little more meaning. So you can have a section and an aside. So you're giving them more semantic value. the next bit was how has it improved my overall production all day? Well, the guys that work with me will know that all I do is yell and scream when I'm having to deal with old code. And all I do with HTML5 is jump up and down dancing. HTML5 is the best thing that has happened to front-end development ever. It's like, remember the first time you discovered CSS or the first time you built a JavaScript rollover. You had to show your mum, you had to point it out, you had to pat yourself on the back. That's HTML5 for me every single day. Sure, there's a bit of a learning curve, but it's not much of a learning curve. I mean, it's not rocket surgery. It's HTML, you know? So don't be afraid of it. Use it. The HTML5 Doctor is there to help you. That's a great site. I spend a lot of time on there. So if you get bogged down or a little bit frightened, remember two things. It's only HTML, and there are smarter people out there to help you learn. Yes?
I use TypeScript a lot, and I found even though I've got access to lots of different typefaces, I'm still finding some of them render atrociously.
Yep.
I'm sure if you've got a couple of typefacing fonts which over, using TypeScript, Google, whatever service, that you find
Render well.
readable,
Okay.
good things.
So the question is, with Typekit, there is lots and lots of fonts, most of which render terribly across platforms. Now, the reason for this is a lot of those fonts were designed to be printed, not to appear on screen. So a lot of the type foundries are now re-hinting. Hinting is basically like the anti-aliasing of a font. So they're re-hinting these fonts specifically for use on screen. Now, the second part of that question was, can I recommend any fonts that will render nicely across platforms? Within Typekit, anything that starts with FF, which is font, all of those fonts have been re-hinted for the screen. All of the new Adobe fonts that have been released, I think it was last week, Typekit and Adobe had a baby, and it's now on Typekit. And those have all been re-hinted, so those render exceptionally well. And there are a few, I can't think of the names offhand, but they have the word web in them. And those are the ones that have been hinted. So, and a cool thing with Typekit is they do allow you to view what that font renders like across all platforms and all browsers. They do a little screenshot so you can go and you can test before you deploy. And the nifty thing with Typekit is if the font does look dodgy, you can always swap it out and you don't have to change any code. You just use the Typekit interface. Yes?
Is CSS3 going to be my beloved jQuery's killer?
Yes, well, not killer, but it'll certainly take some of jQuery's awesomeness away. Some of the transition stuff will certainly move to CSS. But no, I think jQuery is going to hang around for a while, and probably they're going to modify jQuery to use some of this new CSS stuff as well. So what that means is chances are the file size will reduce and the rendering speed will increase as well. Yes? You can still jump into Quirks mode. Is that what you mean? The question is, can you change the box model with CSS3? I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything about that, but I'll be sure to check it out because that could be useful. It's worth noting as well that the doc type for HTML5 looks nothing like the other doc types, but it is very valid. It won't cause your browser to jump into Quirks mode, so you can use that as well. Right, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.